Welcome students to our last video, possibly not our last, but our last video certainly on the core content, that is aggregate supply side theory and the SAC for tomorrow.
And here we have Mr. Chester, top right hand corner. What's his relevance, Mr. Smithers?
Darren Chester. What is
He's the Minister for Infrastructure, isn't he?
Infrastructure, and he's your local member. Well, he's your mum's local member out in Gippsland.
He is our local member down in sunny Gippsland, a little bit wet at the moment. Land Labour Capital, what are we talking about here?
We're talking about how we're going to use the resources to create efficiencies and then move our aggregate supply side to the right.
And why do we want to move it to the right?
Well, we want. I don't know. That's what the book says, Mr. Burns. So, why do we want to move it to the right? Because we want to have sustainable economic growth to increase living standards.
Beautiful. So, students, really one of the key things we need to pick up on here is that the long-run prospect of aggregate supply side policies. You'll notice on this graph here we have aggregate demand drawn as a short-run curve. It's fairly easy to manipulate. It has historically been easy to manipulate the aggregate demand curve in the short run through demand management policies. And that's one side of the economy. This side we're looking at today is the aggregate supply side, or our productive capacity, our capacity to supply goods and services to meet demand. And you can see we have an elastic curve in the short run, and then as it moves to full capacity, it goes inelastic or becomes straighter because we reach our full capacity, our full potential. And if we were to manipulate the aggregate demand curve beyond the full employment level, P1, Q1, we'd get inflation. Not the current problem though, Mr. Smithers.
No, we're stuck down here at P, and my pen's not working, so I can't mark it on the picture for you. But the Mr. Burns is going to have a crack at the pen. That's meant to open OneNotes when you press that. Don't do that. So
I'll give up.
We're stuck down here at the original AD curve at P, and most of the policy and most of the rhetoric around economics writing is how we're going to push aggregate demand up to where we've got it here in the short run. So most of the focus is not on aggregate supply side policies in the current government policy mix.
We'll come to that later. However, the study design does require you to have an understanding of supply side policies in particular. Theoretically speaking, the issue or the purpose of supply side policies is to move the supply curve out and to the right. And as you can see in this rather excellent diagram here that I've created, I've got to talk myself up, no one else does. If we shift our aggregate supply curve out to the right, we get the utopia of economics. We get a low inflationary economic growth. We get an improved output Q1 to Q2 and lower inflation. Don't be frightened to draw curves like this if they're relevant in a SAC or an exam, but make sure you label them properly and you refer to them in your answers. Don't just draw them and don't discuss them, but they are an appropriate piece of content to provide in a SAC or an exam question, providing the question allows for it and you refer to it and discuss it. So that's what we're going to be talking about. What supply side policies we have available to us to shift the aggregate supply curve out to the right, or to mitigate supply side shocks, if you like, which is shifting it the other way.
Now, Mr. Burns, I'm interested because a lot of my students have been talking about, well, if you move aggregate supply side to the right, isn't that bad at the moment because you're putting downward pressure on inflation, and we've got a deflationary problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You could argue we've got a deflationary gap at the moment. I think what it certainly is over the long run. There are some arguments that Say's law, supply creates its own demand. That's the emphasis of supply side policy, that if we increase supply, prices will fall and we will see a corresponding increase in demand. We're not seeing that currently around the global world, although a lot of economists are arguing that inflation will re-emerge over the next 5 to 10 years. In fact, it will come back with a vengeance because we are flooding the world with cheap money. So it's a long-run phenomenon. It's a fairly important point, but one is certainly not going to say we should. Well, most economists would argue we wouldn't be aiming to create supply-side shocks in the economy in order to increase prices.
No, and so what we can say is a movement to the right of the aggregate supply curve, even if it does put downward pressure on inflation, is a good thing for our economy in the long term.
Correct.
For our sustainable economic growth.
And one of the things you could link it to, students, if you really had to, external stability, it improves our international competitiveness, lowers the price of exports, improves our capacity to compete with overseas markets, those sort of things. So we're going to talk about supply side policies today, and the study design talks about 4 key policy areas. Okay, and what is a supply side policy? Well, it's something that will reduce cost of production, improve the efficiency of resources, or improve the availability of resources. And they're the 3 key things we talked about: land, labour and capital at the start. Long-term economic prosperity, the study design talks a lot about that. You should know what it is, and I know we worked on a definition of long-term economic prosperity in both classes. Effectively, it's the intertemporal efficiency concept of sustainable economic growth, maintaining ecological sustainability, so not exploiting current resources for future generations. So it's that intertemporal efficiency component, whilst also improving living standards, both material and non-material, in the short term, whilst also allowing them to be available for the long term.
Yeah, it's ensuring that we have the resources intact at their current or even better level for future generations, so that they don't have a decline in their material living standards.
Okay, so we've got 4 policy areas we need to talk about: budgetary, micro, which is trade led for us, immigration, and environmental policies. And so we're going to run through. That's right, RET. We're going to run through each of these briefly in the next 5 or 10 minutes. So let's jump to budgetary policy. I've identified 2 key areas the budget as a supply side policy can do, and one is infrastructure spending. What do we mean by this, Mr. Smithers?
So if we increase the infrastructure of particularly our economic infrastructure of roads, ports, railways, we can improve businesses' ability to supply goods and services, and of course for our export markets. And this will push out the aggregate supply curve to the right by creating efficiencies, productive efficiencies, technical efficiencies, in the way that our suppliers and our economy can do business.
Now, I saw an interesting thing on the news the other day about Richmond, your area of the Woods, how they're going to knock down the Richmond Netball Centre and build a new area, and there's a massive concern about parking and public transport in your area. Are you having trouble in Richmond in the Taj Mahal there at the moment?
I don't know, it's still being renovated.
Oh, is it? But some infrastructure issues in congestion in the inner city.
There are, and I guess we can look to the non-material living standards when we come to things like migration in regards to that. But of course, we shouldn't be using our. Well, I'm just keeping it relevant. We shouldn't be using our cars in Richmond. We should all be on bikes and public transport, if you ask me. So we shouldn't be complaining too much about congestion. These are areas which are serviced worldwide.
But public transport is the infrastructure is what we're talking about. So increasing Melbourne Rail we've got here, the Metro Tunnel, those sort of things are examples of infrastructure spending. Daniel Andrews, significant infrastructure spending in Victoria on the rail crossings. It's not a federal government policy, but it's a good example of infrastructure aiming to improve efficiencies, gets people to work quicker, cuts costs of production for businesses because goods can move around, less congestion, so there's less transport costs. All these things add up.
Yep. My class has been. I've been focusing a lot on the port. A lot of work's been done on increasing the efficiency of the Port of Melbourne, which carries 40% of our import-export out of there. And we know we've had the dredging to get bigger ships in. We know we've had increased access to the port through rail by the movement of the wholesale fruit markets out to Epping from Footscray. So a lot of work's been done to increase the efficiency there. So there's a lot of infrastructure projects that you can talk about, but you've got to relate that back to aggregate supply.
Okay. And the other area the budget is able to focus on the supply side is improving labour force participation. And this is one of the issues I know we've discussed in class about the ageing population, but any policy area the recent policy area from the recent budgets that will improve the people's engagement with work. And that doesn't mean they necessarily have to be working, but the idea is that they're rejoining the labour force, so they're starting to seek work. And childcare rebates is one. The recent income tax cuts, it's a pretty small income tax cuts, but at the margins it might encourage more people to re-engage with work and rejoin the labour force and increase their participation. So these are some examples of supply-side policies from the budget. It's not as simple as infrastructure. You might want to look at improving labour force from some certain key policies in that area.
With that in mind, I think the way we've looked at this a little bit is to say, what are the incentives for people to get into the labour force? That is the childcare rebate and possibly tax cuts. But also that there's a lot of stuff around about disincentives for people who are out of work. So if you're reducing welfare payments, or if you are reducing the ability for people to be on a higher welfare payment, such as the disability, then you're actually providing an incentive the other way around from the other end. So there's a couple of ways to look at this.
But that assumes they're going to be able to re-engage in the workforce.
Yes, and I think that's the underlying assumption, is that a lot of people who are on disability could actually be in work in the labour force. And
I'm not so sure about that.
well, I think there are some people on the margins who've been relying on disability who could possibly be working a little bit more. So we might be.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah,
the right wingers coming out. The Chardonnay Socialist has been put away.
My inner Tony Abbott's just reared its ugly head.
It is actually one of the growing areas. I mean, all jokes aside, welfare, increasing in welfare expenditure, the age pension, disability support pension is one of the growing areas in the budget, and that does affect our debate around budget repair and lifters and leaners that good old your mate Joe brought out earlier on last year. So yeah, it's an interesting area.
All right, we've got to keep moving.
We better punch on. So micro reform, obviously we focused on trade liberalisation. It's basically the removal of trade barriers. It's the movement such as tariffs, quotas, subsidies, these sort of things, and it's a belief in free trade. And you should link it back to that. We focused on a number of key FTAs, particularly more recently China or CHAFTA. I would encourage students to know some specific markets that have improved access, and again, and some of the details around that wouldn't hurt as well. Don't forget that in theory and in practice, we are going to areas where we have a comparative advantage. Agriculture, we have an advantage, a clear advantage. In mining, we have an advantage. Tourism, education. So these are the areas that we've sought within these free trade agreements to increase access to overseas markets, and other countries have increased their access to the Australian markets as a result. We've mainly gone down the bilateral trade agreements as opposed to multilateral, because multilateral were just too hard.
Yeah, as is being proved at the moment with America.
Yeah.
Looking to knock back our latest multilateral.
Trans-Pacific Partnership.
So within that, there's and on sector, there are a number of information sheets on those free trade agreements, and I note that in a couple of practice sacks I've looked at, people have talked specifically about the beef industry within agriculture, and when you combine that with the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund, you're starting to see a picture of the policies combining the budgetary policy of the infrastructure along with the free trade agreement, where we have advantage in agriculture, and that's leading to a bigger level of export. And as we looked at in my class, the populations of these countries is, South Korea around 50 million, Japan over 100 million, and we know how big China is, over 1.3 billion. These are big markets, and if we can grow these industries, then we may get some advantage in our CAD as a result, because of the high populations of those countries. So, there could be some upside in terms of external stability, but please remember that when you undergo trade liberalisation, these countries don't sign these agreements if they don't think they're going to get something out of it as well.
But there's a synergies from this. There's mutual benefit, and that's the theory of free trade, that if we specialise in trade, both countries will be better off.
Yep.
And Ricardo proved that many years ago. So, and this is one of the things students, I think forgetting the SAC and economics and the study design and all that, but in terms of protectionism, the growing protectionism that's occurring in countries around the world actually will lead to a decline in material living standards for a lot of people. That's the economics of it.
Yep.
The social policy, where those benefits are going to, that's a different question. But economically speaking, free trade does improve efficiencies and outputs, and increase access to markets is generally of benefit to countries. How those benefits are distributed, if they're unfairly distributed, that's a social issue, and I'm not washing my hands of it, but that's something countries need to grapple with.
And did you read Gittins on Saturday, or were you too busy recovering from Year 10 retreat?
I was recovering from Year 10 retreat. I was preparing for Mother's 80th birthday party, I must admit. We had a massive day on Sunday.
Was Mr. Chester there?
Yeah. So, Sorry,
Mr. Gibbs just interrupted.
Interrupting us, but we're in the middle of a massive debate here, Mr. Gibbs. You'll have to come back.
Right.
Move on. Had enough of this.
Oh, you didn't want to talk about... Anyway, if you do get a chance to read Gittins' article, and I'll try and remember to send it out, it's fantastic about foreign investment. and why foreign investment leads to higher material living standards. And he makes a very, very clear and not too complicated case for it.
And that was in light of the recent knocking back by the Treasurer on public interest grounds of China's attempt to buy Ausgrid, the New South Wales electricity market, which was quite interesting. Right, third policy, environmental policy. There was an exam question a couple of years ago about the economic impacts of climate change.
Got a pen back.
Oh, thank you, Mrs. Wern. The economic impacts of climate change, I think it was 2013. So you should know a little bit of what I call the consequences of climate change. And here we're talking about adverse weather effects, such as droughts, increased severity of key weather events such as floods, bushfires. We're talking about issues around loss of biodiversity, coral bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, obviously we've seen this year. There are significant impacts starting to emerge of climate change, economic impacts. They're not just environmental impacts. And the old dialogue where the environment and the economy were separate, most people, Frydenberg was talking about recently in the news, that you cannot divorce the economy from the environment. They are intrinsically linked and interdependent upon each other. So, it's something that students, as economic students, we need to know there are severe and significant economic impacts of climate change.
So even if you are a closet denier, Julian, I think for the purposes of this SAC and the rest of the year in economics, we will accept that climate change is real.
Yes. Along with 99.9% of the world's scientists, NASA, the International Meteorological Organisation.
Just a couple of crackpots in our Senate who don't believe.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
anyway,
if you voted for them students, that'll take a long, hard look at yourself.
All right. So what have we focused on? We've focused on the RET, or the Renewable Energy Target, which aims to get us up to 23.5% of our electricity being derived by renewables. Of course, that includes solar, wind. What are the other ones?
There's a heap of them. It's on the PowerPoint. There's biogas, landfill gas. There's thermal, tidal. There's a range of renewable targets that the renewable or the Clean Energy Regulator has identified. And clearly, you do need to know that non-renewable energy, effectively, is energy such as coal, clearly, oil, natural gas is non-renewable, so it's not part of this process. Anything that involves burning fossil fuels. Great quote going around on the radio at the moment about coal. If we burn all the world's coal that's in the ground, we will be cooked. The economy of the globe will be cooked. Coal, one scientist is quoting at the moment that coal is the leading source of global greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, we know Tony loves coal.
Thank God he's not. Anyway, that we won't go into that. So the push, of course, is for all providers to either embrace renewables, or they have to purchase certificates in order to meet their renewable target as set out by the regulator.
It's a little bit complicated, but it is worthwhile knowing how it works and be able to write a paragraph, a summary of how it all works and what its intent is. And that's something we'll talk about in a little while.
All right. So you've got those.
There he is. Yeah. Tony's back. He's loving it.
With a beard. So what's the intent of the policy? How it impacts intertemporal efficiency, of course, because if we, as Mr. Burns was saying with regards to coal, if we keep relying on coal, then where's our intertemporal efficiency? Well, it's not in a good place. The market failure, that is the negative externalities of production of electricity through coal. And, of course, that impact on both material and non-material living standards. And I think we've done quite a bit on this in the respective classes. So if you know that in relation to RET, know the policy itself, the basic tenements of it, and the trading that may occur with regards to the certificates. And of course, 2020 is pretty close, and
we're a long way off. Too.
We're a long way off. What are we sitting at? 12
12.3 or
12 point something.
Yeah.
and currently being met by renewables, and that's got to get up to 23.5. So there could be some
Here's a
big trading.
quiz for you. Which state relies upon renewable energy as the most significant source of their energy?
No, I'm going to say Tassie.
South Australia.
They've got more renewables.
40%. 40% of South Australia's energy comes from renewables.
That's fantastic.
Whereas 4% of Queensland's.
So, well, they want all those protectionist policies in there with the xenophobic team.
There you go.
The xenophons. All right, let's move on to immigration.
So, immigration policy. Now, students, I just want to make a clear point here. We're not talking about immigration in terms of refugees and boat people. This is not immigration policy. Is a legitimate economic policy within Australia, and it has three key areas, of which one is the focus, and it's skilled migration. Okay, we have a skilled migration process, of which the significant majority of our immigrants that come to Australia come under this program. And of the skilled migration, I know in my class I focused on the 457 visa, which is a temporary workplace visa where you are sponsored. You're on the SOL list, the skilled occupation list, and you can come to Australia for 4 years. It has been controversial, the 457, because it has been abused through some unscrupulous sponsors over the years and some unscrupulous operators. There has been some recent changes to the legislation to improve the 457 visa and its integrity, and it still does exist. What is going on there? What are you doing?
No, that's my computer. It sometimes just has a little moment. So we're just going to try and bring it back to size.
You?
No, that's my computer. It sometimes has a mind of its own.
The IT department's helping you out there, I can see.
All right, so the 457 visa is, of course, to fill skill gaps. And that even though we're not at full employment, there are still some skill gaps. And
Correct.
If you look around, and I know we've talked about, health, people in the health industry in regional areas of Australia.
Yep.
I mean, there is shortages there because there's an unwillingness of people to move into those areas. So there is still some skill shortages in our economy, even though we're sitting, significantly above the level of full employment.
So what's immigration policy trying to do? What sort of goals is it trying to fix? And you've got things like Mr. Smith just talked about the skills shortage. It can also help alleviate the ageing population. You could argue it also helps promote economic activity. Certainly the Housing Industry Association of Australia are big supporters of a strong migration program because they know that recently arrived migrants to Australia do provide significant economic stimulus to the economy, particularly around housing. That's a key part of providing economic activity in Australia, and I know the housing construction industry has helped pick up some of the slack in the Australian economy as we've ended the mining investment boom and the mining boom. So there are significant economic benefits for immigration in Australia, and it's a key supply-side policy because it adds to that key resource at the very start of this PowerPoint we put forward, labour. Bit dodgy though, don't you think? We take other countries' skilled employees, bring them to one of the wealthiest countries in the world. They train them up, they look after, invest their limited resources in providing skilled labour, and then they hop on a plane and come to Australia.
We did have a discussion around the ethics in my class, and I did suggest unethically that the best people were highly educated, impotent people. So that they would have a long working life and be single their whole lives, not produce children, therefore be very good participants in terms of taxation and the budget problem.
That's right. Yes.
But ethically, if we're draining, the best people from India, and they've got a whole population, they're going to have food shortages and all these issues. But that's probably not for today. This is that would be good for all our students who are going to go on and do commerce and economics at university.
Absolutely, and
that'll be an area where they can really sink their teeth into.
And as young men and women of the future, these are some of the moral questions I think we all need to grapple with. Is it right that we take the best and the brightest from around the world and bring them to Australia when we haven't invested in them? I think there's perhaps a question there that as policymakers we should be looking at. Anyway, we digress.
A purist would just say supply and demand.
Well, it's not as simple as that.
No, it's not. But that's what a purist might say. So, you need to know a little bit about the immigration policy, particularly we're talking about this idea of skills, and the family component often comes from those people who've come originally through the skilled
Mm.
program.
They're allowed to bring dependents. They're allowed to bring other people.
So that's where we have a lot of our family, which makes up virtually the bulk of the rest from the other 32%. All right.
And we don't have, just on that, we don't have a refugee problem in this country. All right? Everyone else thinks you might think we do. The reality is, students, we don't. If you want to see a refugee problem, go to the Middle East, go to Europe, go to other parts of the world.
Yeah, on that 6,500 people yesterday alone in one day.
Libya.
And were rescued. So let's put that into perspective. All right, we've
Nearly done. Policy mix.
Yeah, now we alluded to this at the start, that the policy mix is quite difficult at the moment when we're talking about macro and aggregate supply side policies. And most of the focus is, of course, on the macro. So all you're hearing in the news is budget repair, and then you've got the Reserve Bank doing all the heavy lifting in terms of trying to stimulate aggregate demand by pushing rates down to the record low of 1.5, where the cash rate currently sits.
So how do we then, if we get a question on aggregate supply and the policy mix, how do we link aggregate supply into the policy mix? Because really, as you said, we're just trying to promote demand.
Well, I think it depends whether we're talking about a particular goal in the economy, such as external stability or such as economic growth. We need to talk about specific areas that are aiming to improve this outcome. So what you need to do is relate every part of the policy mix if you're asked for both macro and aggregate supply, and you're asked for their input. So I think you need to talk about the policies that are in place, whether it's the stance of the budget or particularly some particular budget initiatives that have influenced the particular goal. So you need to be careful how you structure this. You probably need to talk about whether they're conflicting or compatible.
And you'd also want to focus, well, I would suggest you identify the short run and long run nature and distinguish between the two in the policy areas. Aggregate demand is a short run phenomenon, or we can attempt to manipulate the aggregate demand curve in the short run, whereas aggregate supply is a long run policy that we will benefit from over time. And there are multiplier effects of good aggregate supply side policies that they will add to demand, could argue quite strongly, particularly government expenditure. G2, we're crying out for increased infrastructure spending in this country. Some economists would argue we don't have a budget problem. We don't, we should be spending more. Money is low, global interest rates are low. We shouldn't be focused on this fallacy of debt and deficit. We should be focusing upon future-proofing the economy around massive infrastructure spending. And we could fix a lot of Australia's current economic issues with some genuinely well-targeted, efficient government infrastructure programs around water, around transport, around key forms of public policy in terms of improving the interaction of our resources, of reducing congestions, our cities' focus. Infrastructure spending could be an area we could see some significant improvements, and that would add to growth as well. So it's not a zero-sum game. Are we done?
Well, yeah. If that was your last video, it was quite powerful. So this could be it for Mr. Burns. As you know, he's leaving soon. So
I'll be back.
Yeah, he wants to be heard again north of the river. So we may get him back for a revision video or something of the like. But we've enjoyed putting these together for you. So good luck in tomorrow's SAC. Certainly hope you get time to listen to this.
Yes.
And if you've got this far, you've done well. So good luck, and we will be back. Mr.
Adios.